awesome.
We could take like one or two questions real quick, if anybody has them. Brandon?
Hey.
So, thank you very much. That really resonated with me as well. So, one of the things that I just thought about, what you were saying about technology, social media, Facebook and everything else, everyone is contributing like to their language. Yeah. And not being intentional about it. And it's having this huge ramification.
Yeah.
And something that I've been noticing, at least among my friend groups, is that it's actually starting to impact adoption of Facebook. I know people who are now leaving the technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. He just mentioned that, social media and the fact that people are kind of creating their own language, and they're able to express themselves in ways they weren't before. Even if we compare this last election season to 2008, it's a whole new universe, right, compared to then. And that people are even starting to kind of leave Facebook because it's getting to be so much. And actually, now that you mentioned that, it occurs to me that maybe that's why they're stepping up their efforts to do something about some of this. Because Silicon Valley, they like to talk a talk, but they're still about the bottom line, right? I remember back in the day, late '80s, when I was I was one of these internet utopians a little bit, right? I was like, this is amazing. This is going to change the world. It's going to be so great. And nowadays, I'm starting to kind of be wistful about the old days of old media where you had professionals deciding, no, that shouldn't be published. That's probably a bad idea. I think if anything, what this is telling, well, there's a lot of things that are going on, but one thing definitely is that I don't think we realized to what degree the medium of our communication was constraining things in a certain way culturally, right? For good or ill, but I mean, but the way that we communicate and the kind of conversations we can even have was constrained by the medium. I mean, newspapers have been struggling with this now for 10, 15 years, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond that, I don't know. This is hard, right? So a lot of people say, hey, just go do something about it. Facebook, do something about it. Twitter, kick him off, right? And I'm like, I'm like, well, how's that going to fix anything? Because they're just going to find another outlet to express themselves. And I don't want to shut down the whole internet, right? People need to be able to express themselves. So I think in a way what's happened is the mechanisms of our discourse have gotten way out front of our adjustment to our literacy about them, right? I can foresee a point where we're teaching, grammar school kids about media literacy much more intentionally to understand what is trustworthy, what is not, because it's tricky, right? It's tricky. Anyway, there we go.
Everybody thank Andrew.
Yeah, thank you.
And you are sticking around, right? You're one of the mentors. So he'll be around. You have other questions. You're happy for people to come up and chat, I'm sure. So, all righty. So we have one more panel. This is exciting. You guys come on up. This is a group from Jasmine Henschel is the moderator, and she is a UX designer at Thrive, and one of my cohorts on a daily basis. We have a good time. And this is a student panel, which she's going to introduce from Georgia Tech. We got some feedback last year that we wanted to have a lot of different kinds of voices at World IA Day. So we are, and we're happy about it. We thank you guys for being here. And yay. I do have a stool for you too if you want it. So, or you can be there, wherever you want to be. So they're going to have about 50 minutes, and we're going to talk about AR and VR interface. And then as soon as that's over, we're going to have lunch. And then as soon as that's over, we're going to go to the mentoring. So during lunch, I'll tell you some more, but if you haven't signed up for a mentoring conversation group, it will be the time. And also meet people so you can fill out your form. So with that, take it away, Jasmine.
Perfect, okay.
All right, so as Rebecca mentioned, my name's Jasmine. I'm a UX designer at Thrive, and I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves really quickly.
Hi, I'm Annie Huber. I'm a student at Georgia Tech in human-computer interaction, and I currently study and do projects in virtual reality.
Hello, I'm Sarthak. I'm also a student at Georgia Tech. I'm studying HCI. I'm in the second year of my master's. I'm really interested in creating, designing interactive environments, and that's how I got into AR and VR.
Hi, my name is Josh Fisher. I'm a doctoral student at Georgia Tech in the digital media program. I primarily do research in interactive documentary design across a range of virtuality technologies from augmented to mixed to virtual reality.
Hi everyone, my name is Amit Garg, also a HEI student, second year. I have a background in neuroscience and got into VR through Georgia Tech. I'm really interested in design of virtual environments, but also the research and evaluation of them.
Hi everyone, my name is Tika Lin. I'm a second year digital media student in Georgia Tech, and I'm particularly interested in designing for mixed reality, entertaining and learning experience. So right now my master project is about augmented reality tour for Georgia Aquarium, which is exciting.
All right, so with that, we'll get started. I want to just give a brief kind of overview. We all talk about AR and VR and hear these words, but I wanted to point out that there is a distinction between the two. So when we're talking about VR, we're typically talking about highly immersive environments where the goal is to transport someone to a new place, essentially. So for the designer, that has a lot of implications about sense of presence and identity and what you're designing for. Now, with augmented reality, we're talking about things where the experience is rooted in the person's current physical environment, but we're kind of overlaying digital elements on top of that. So I just wanted to make that distinction before we get started. We're going to cover about 3 broad topics today, and then we'll leave a few minutes for questions at the end. So we're going to talk about the domains and tasks that AR and VR are suited for. We'll cover how we can take a lot of design and research methodologies that are being used in the UX space currently for more 2D screen-based designs, and then we're going to talk about diversity and how we incorporate that and whose responsibility it is to think about that when we're designing these environments. So with that, so the first topic we're going to cover, which types of tasks and domains are AR and VR currently well suited for, and how do we think that that might change in the next 3 to 5 years?
So this is not exactly a very simple question. AR and VR are very different things, and even in the middle we have mixed reality, which is essentially moving from augmented into virtual reality through very specific interactions. The domains that we commonly see with augmented reality right now range from things that are really simple, like using Yelp Monocle to look down the street and see the ratings of restaurants that pop up, to educational materials, to using sort of diagrams overlaid on top of mechanical engines for educational purposes. These are instructional. The question is, in 3 to 5 years, how can we use these same tools to tell stories? That's where virtual reality is certainly excelling at the moment, in my opinion, as a relation to AR.
I genuinely think that this is a question that a lot of companies are currently really working at answering. Research amongst companies is happening all over the field. So it's hard for us to really answer those questions. But currently, a lot of the experience that exists are mostly video games and 3D movies that people can look around in. But there's also a lot of research being done in how to train people in professional jobs, for example, surgeons, without actually having to deal with real bodies, or flight simulators. Also, I know that there's research being done in digital stores, so places where people can actually look at items and interact as if they were real.
So I think VR, AR, both of these have been traditionally been used for defense and simulation, and that is still one of the main applications of the field. But right now, I think entertainment plays a big part because that's how it gains popularity, and if that fails, everything else fails. But having said that, I would like to mention like a few exciting things that I find I think AR and VR are very well suited for. For AR, I think smart home control is a very interesting field because So I was working in one of these projects where you can kind of point a projector towards any appliance in your home, and you can see its like status, like what's the temperature, you can control stuff, overlaid on top of the device. So that way you don't have to look at your remote control and at the device at the same time. So it kind of focuses your attention on one place. For VR, I think the collaborative space is a very interesting thing. Like, I think we have all experienced all space VR, where you're put into a common environment with people from all over the world and you're talking with them. But I think if you think of Skype, doing video conference with your loved ones in a VR setting is, I think something like that will be a really exciting thing to explore. And I feel in the next 3 to 5 years, that will be something that we should look out for. Like, imagine if you're in Italy in some restaurant sitting with your loved one in a VR setting. Like, that's amazing.
So I think just the way that augmented reality is designed for is a little more considered on the go, right? You think about things like Google Glass. It's meant to be worn while someone's walking down the street, and to provide contextual information to the person. And so that, I think in 3 to 5 years, companies who are looking into AR right now will really see that as a sort of channel of engagement with customers and with users. Whereas I think VR is a little more, is a little less contextual to that space, more of immersive storytelling experiences that a person, at least now, can experience in their own home. And you're not going to really see anybody walking down the street with, a head-mounted display on. And I think to mirror what someone said about the collaborative space, Arthur, so like Facebook's acquisition of Oculus, right? You're seeing that Oculus is getting this hugely social space influence in terms of the applications that they're designing for Oculus and for VR. So you're seeing that sort of social collaborative push from Facebook and Oculus.
So I've seen the right now VR and AR have been implemented in industry like travel, entertainment, health, military, and all that. And I think there are mainly, right now there are 2 categories. One is for immersive experience like 360 movie or like immersive game. And the other is just for specific tasks, like you do medical training or like military training. But I think in 3 to 5 years, as I imagine, it will be more into our day-to-day life. Like it will help us with daily tasks. For example, for those tasks that include like multiple options to preview before you can make decision. For example, it will be really interesting if you go to the restaurant and you can see all that menu being shown, like how it will be cooked after it cooked, and you decide which to choose. And also for transportation, right now we have to look up the phone. If our train is delayed, we have to reschedule it on our phone. But what if you go to the station and you just see it's showing up in the augmented reality, like your HoloLens, and you don't really need to look it up. It will just tell you what's the best route to go to. And the other one I feel very interesting is like, right now there is some application for that. As a retail shopping, for example, you want to see what furniture look like in your home. You don't need to measure it. You can just view it in virtual reality and see that. And also, the other one is like a library. For example, right now you have to look up the library system, searching for the information you want. What if you can just look into it in augmented reality and you can quickly search like right now I have this keyword and I want to connect the information to that and just search for that information in mixed reality way.
Thank you for asking that question. It actually leads to the point I was going to add on to what Tika was saying is, yes, there is this definite issue right now with the maturity of virtuality mediums and what they can accomplish. All of us up here are very involved in doing the research to design the grammars for interactions and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Part of that and part of what's happening is within the next year in nightly builds of Mozilla and in Chrome, you're having WebVR. WebVR is much more easy to implement than the stuff that you see in Oculus and the Vive that requires Unity and a lot of programming. So by making it easier, by making the environment for virtuality easier, by making the entire onboarding process easier, we'll have a lot more practitioners entering the space. Will they create experiences that are perfectly suited? Perhaps not always, but it's part of this incredibly sort of exploratory phase that we're in. People who are interested in WebVR, I would encourage you to check out A-Frame, which allows you to do programming of these WebVR experiences in 4 to 5 lines of code. The benefit of this, to just go off of the IKEA example in furniture, is a lot of these experiences are built for apps, which is actually kind of a huge pain. You've got to go to the App Store, download the app, open the app, learn how to use the app, and then experience the content. With WebVR and having it just be in the browser on a web page, you move from, I really like that chair, to pressing a button to seeing that chair through your browser like Safari. So this is the direction we're going, and hopefully we start to answer some of those questions.
Another thing I would like to add is the technological, a lot of problem arises because of the expectation doesn't meet what you have. And I think that's the reason why something as brilliant as the Google Glass failed to gain ground, because what they show is not what you get. They show a lot of things and you're wowed to look at those videos, but when you wear them, it doesn't perform. But you have to understand that it's a part of an evolutionary process. So if you would now wear the Microsoft HoloLens, which is kind of similar to what the Google Glass wanted to achieve, but it's much, much more better. Even then, the HoloLens has a lot of downfalls where you have to keep scanning your environment, and you cannot basically walk around with it. Although you can still walk around in your own room because it's already been scanned. So what I would say is it's a part of a process, and we need to kind of experiment and also hold our horses to give them a chance and give the technology a chance to evolve.
Together, I wondered if you had to give an example of one domain or professional field where you think that the technology is at a place currently or will be in the next year or so where it definitely will have value. We've heard a lot of examples from a lot of different places, but where is there unquestionably going to be a big impact?
I think right now travel is definitely one field that VR is already implemented and well accepted. I know there's one company called UVisit. It starts from doing a campus tour, virtual tour for all famous college in the United States. Right now they turn their virtual tour online into a 360 and also web VR. And I think that's one thing that's really good, because people always have a desire to explore different places, and we don't really have time and money for that. So that would be a really cool thing to implement, and it's right now accepted by most people.
I've got a kind of a unique use case to talk about. The Augmented Environments Lab at Georgia Tech partnered with GTRI to essentially go into a poultry farm and use augmented reality. Not exactly the most common use case that would come to mind. But there are things with chickens that you just can't see when you look at them that you have to pick up with sensors. I'm not a chicken expert, I don't know, but apparently there are. On these poultry lines, these chickens go by apparently at 180 chickens per minute. And sometimes these chickens are sick and they have to be pulled off the line. And that's really hard to do for somebody in that instance. So GTRI got with the Augmented Environments Lab to fit out all the chicken coops with sensors that then were able to tag the chickens. And then when chickens were going down the line, the worker, through their headset, were able to see chickens that were marked as being sick or unhealthy and were pulled off the line so that because they weren't safe for human consumption. So that's a very specific use case, right? But that's an instance that we know works.
Yeah.
Okay,
One thing that's certain is gaming, right? Yeah. And it's going to stay there. It's amazing. And I think the next thing that's going to happen is multiplayer gaming, which still doesn't exist much. And having 2 players in the same environment in VR is something that's going to come about in the next 1 to 3 years, I guess.
With that, we'll move on. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use methodology that we're currently used to, if you'd say that, in our design and research when we're talking about UX and IA. But I want to tell a little story. So I was participating in a user study with a few of our panelists where I got to do this experience with room scale VR. So it was a game simulation, kind of an interactive narrative type thing, and I had a headset on and was in a room with controllers and just fully immersed in this experience where I'm crawling through a cave and trying to climb up this wall. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced something like that.
And then about a week later, one of the students who had organized the study was showing me a video. It was just a trailer to kind of explain what this environment was, and my immediate reaction was, hey, I was there. And I was like, whoa, like, I wasn't there. That's not a real place. How was that my immediate reaction? So we're talking about completely immersive environments in the case of VR and certain things with AR where this is a totally different experience for users than when you're just looking at a screen. Like, I've never had that reaction to an app before. So I want to talk about how we can leverage some of the existing approaches and think about, for this entirely new paradigm, what do we need to do to either exploit the things that we're using or just completely start fresh?
One thing that is really interesting with VR is that you're not, usually when we're used to designing experiences for digital worlds, we design for screens. So we're used to rules of composition and having a very limited space to work with and having a frame and guiding the eye with the usual visual design rules that we've learned. But in virtual reality, these don't exist. You don't have a limited field of view. It's everywhere around you. So it's a lot more like designing experiences for the real physical space than it is for actually designing out of digital experiences. And another thing is that the VR field is not actually new. Research has been done for more than 20 years in it. It's just been exploding now, and the medium is finally becoming more accessible to the general public, and that is really why we hear about it a lot more. That is what the technology has been doing.
So I'll tell a story about my own personal experience about designing for VR. So I was trying to do a study where I would invite participants and ask them to design their own, like create their own designs for, so I was creating like pop-ups for VR, and I wanted them to come up with the designs. But then I realized that like for a mobile screen, you can give a wireframe, you can give a sketch, but that's not exactly so easily done in VR. So the thought I had was, what if I create a fake 3D room structure? Like I create an actual real world environment. I put desks, I put tabletops, I put like computers, phones, whatever that I wish to have in a VR world. And then I make people wear a cardboard glass with actually nothing there. So it's kind of a simulation where you put the person there in a fake room, wearing a fake glass, and then you ask them to design for that environment. So I haven't really tested out that, but that was something that I felt that might be a counterpart for wireframing, like wireframing as we know it for mobile screens, might be, like that might be the way to go forward with VR. So doing that study, I also realized that it's kind of very difficult to perform participatory design with VR. So if you know about participatory design, it basically involves involving all your stakeholders in the design process, right? But there is one thing, like it depends on a common level of knowledge for all the stakeholders. Like, for example, if I design something for the mobile phone, I know that everybody uses it, and it's very easy to find people who will give you insights about that. But for VR, it's not yet as ubiquitous as a mobile phone. So I think there was this paper where they had to do a 4-day workshop to get people to a certain level of knowledge before they could start doing a participatory design process. So I think that's something that doesn't extend so well from our digital world to our VR world.
So I think with augmented reality, one very particularly important term to consider is flow. The flow of your digital content into the real world and your relationship your digital content has with the real world. So, for example, if everybody looked at the exit sign behind you right now, is that what we want our augmented reality to look like? A bunch of hanging signs. So we have to think about how we design and display these things. And that's really important. We don't necessarily want to walk around in a meme-verse where everything has, white fonts and black outlines around it. When we're talking about designing for virtual environments, it's incredibly helpful to actually think of theater. So if we look back at performance spaces and the way that set designers and scenographers, which is sort of the theoretical set designers from Europe, the way they design spaces to facilitate certain interactions and experiences, we can actually learn a lot to help us design sort of pathways or prime our users to make particular choices in the experiences we create.
So I think, right, in traditional user experience design or in the design field for digital artifacts, you think about this concept of affordances, right? A button should look like it's a button because it affords that action to click on it. In VR, at least in my experience, that principle still exists, and it's still very much talked about in the project that I worked on. I think of it more as like, similar to like interior design, right, of a room, or like the design of a physical chair or something, right? A chair affords the action of sitting on it because it looks like a chair, it has these qualities. In VR, you still have to design digital artifacts to have those affordances, right? And it's a little bit harder because you don't necessarily have the tactile feedback of sitting down on a chair or feeling the handle on a mug or something. And of course, you are still limited to the type of input you have to the virtual world, which is things like controllers or gloves or things like that. But the artifacts that you design in virtual reality, at least, should have that same concept of affordances. And another technique that we used in my project was sort of like a wireframe, but also sort of like a blueprint. And I did a lot of research about how architects use blueprints to plan out their spaces. And because you're designing a 3D space, a virtual environment, using blueprints to sort of map out how a person will walk through, at least in room scale VR, how a person will walk through your space is hugely helpful. And we went through the whole process of using trace paper and overlaying pieces of trace paper over on top of each other to see where, how can we design the pathway that a person will take in the virtual environment using that technique. So we thought that was very helpful.
So in my experience, I feel the design process of the traditional UX like web and app and the VR and AR is still very similar. It's just the consideration should be much broader. For example, in my AR project for aquarium, I first identify the problem that people use the existing app cannot find a specific target easily. Like if I want to know whale shark, I have to go down the top-down menu and scroll all the way down to find W, and it's very troublesome. So I figure out, oh, maybe I can use augmented reality to serve that. So I designed a active fish menu that will have some animated fish floating in front of your screen, and you can just click on that as a menu. So you can click on it and navigate to the desired, like the fish or check out the dolphin show time. And during that process, I think one different thing about from the UX design is that there's just only few examples I can refer to. So when I do the brainstorm, I have to look up the so the research part is more difficult. More like you have to brainstorm yourself and try out, like sketch down, get feedback from people. But also when I do the prototype, it's not as easy as you just do a 2D screen. I have to hand code in Unity 3D and get the feedback from people. But I think the whole process is still very similar. Like I do user testing and iterate on my design and then get feedback from them. Yeah, so I think as we have more people develop design in AR or VR, and we can have more reference for that, we all get experience on that. We will have more concrete research resource for that.
So I want to relate this back to what Andrew was talking about. He talked a lot about labels in language. Do these things carry the same weight? Do you have to think about them in the same way as a designer when we're talking about these more immersive experiences? Can we use the same types of methods? Do they need to change? Or, I don't know, what do we think about that?
So for my personal...
Yeah, in a moment.
Yeah, so for my personal experience, I feel a very distinct difference between app and web design and VR/AR is that VR/AR has a very specific context you need to design for. For example, if you are doing an immersive story, you have to, I made a werewolf transforming experience in VR, and I have to look up the werewolf lycanthropy story, and also I have to understand what's the world, like the medical era, what does it look like. So you really need to know, just like the content and language are very important, you really need to know what's the specific context in that story.